Hello, welcome to Chaplain Chatter. I'm Kevin, your host. Today I want to talk about one thing that occurs to every brand new chaplain, as well as every well-established, seasoned chaplain. The one consistent thing that we must learn to face as First Response Chaplains is rejection. Chaplain, I want you to think about your first time walking into the station for roll call or to visit those on-duty fire EMS crews. That first visit is filled with skeptical stares, with avoidance, with very guarded interaction, and mistrust. Even after hundreds of visits, there will always be an LEO or a firefighter EMT that wants nothing to do with you. Religion in today's postmodern America is playing less and less of a role in the first response world and in first responder lives. As I interact with law enforcement officers, with those serving in the fire EMS side, dispatchers, most have little or no religious upbringing. Some that I've spoken with have never set foot in a church and have no desire to do so. The last thing some of these first responders want is for the chaplain to hang out with them on shift, to do a ride along with them. I've even had officers tell me that a chaplain would never set foot in their patrol car. But what is a definition of rejection? How can we define the power of that word? And it is a powerful definition. The definition of reject means to refuse to have, take, or recognize, to refuse to accept, or to discard as useless. Now, I think every chaplain that I've encountered would sit down and say, you know what, I've experienced those things. I have been refused to be recognized in the department. I've been refused to be taken on a ride along. I've been unaccepted because I'm not a member of law enforcement or I'm not a firefighter or paramedic. I have been discarded as useless because people just don't want anything to do with God. Rejection happens not only in roll calls and ride-alongs and station visits, it occurs on scene as well. During crisis, the last thing many people want to do is speak with someone representing God. After all, how could God have allowed this situation to happen? I've heard it many times, and it's a paraphrase, but it's like, chaplain, what can you possibly say to me that's going to comfort me in this time of loss? I don't have any belief system that's going to agree with what you're telling me. I've heard it. I've heard it time and time again. There are two occupations that people tend to mistrust and hate, and that's law enforcement and the church. There have been a lot of people hurt by the church over decades and centuries. And as the chaplain, if that person's been hurt by the church, as a chaplain, you represent what caused that hurt and pain. So we as chaplains experience rejection by those we serve. We're really in good company, though. Jesus was rejected by the politicians, the religious leaders, and by the people of his day. Now, obviously, this podcast comes to you from a Christian worldview. I don't apologize for that. I know there are other religions, other faiths, other worldviews. I'm just giving you my perspective. It's a tool in the tool belt. If you have a different faith, different religion, different scriptures, you go to those and you respond to those the way they tell you to do that. I'm giving you the Christian perspective. In the midst of the rejection, Jesus pressed forward to complete his Father's will. We can do the same thing. We can press forward to complete our calling as chaplains. Psalm 118:22 says, "The stone that the builders rejected has now become the cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing." That was part of his plan. And it is wonderful to see. In ancient times, even in modern construction, but in ancient times when a builder was to construct a structure, There was great care taken in selecting the stones that would be used. Each stone was examined for its strength, its integrity, its suitability. Well, during this selection process, some of those stones would be rejected and cast aside, deemed unfit for use. And what the author of this psalm, what the psalmist is saying, he's speaking prophetically and speaking about the coming Messiah. The stone that was to be rejected was Christ. John says in the book of John, chapter 1, He, Jesus, was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world didn't recognize him. He came to his own, and his own did not receive him. He was rejected. The religious builders of the day, the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, failed to recognize him as God's chosen and anointed one, and they rejected him as the cornerstone of faith and salvation. You know, Jesus even quoted Psalm 118 during his final debate in the temple in Matthew 21, and you can read that. The apostles Paul and Peter reference Psalm 118 in Ephesians 2 and 1 Peter 2:5. Each describes the foundation and the building of the church. Paul wrote, Therefore you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of God's household, built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, with Christ Jesus himself as the cornerstone. Peter wrote, He, Jesus, was rejected by people, but he was chosen by God for great honor. And you are living stones that God is building into his spiritual temple. So he's calling Christians living stones that are built upon the cornerstone that was rejected by man. You know, being a first response chaplain, it requires endurance, it requires integrity, and it requires strength and focus. We have to stay focused on our calling and our mission. Certain rejection is going to happen because of who we represent. When that happens, we can place our trust in the cornerstone of our faith. Without a doubt, he gives us the best example possible of how to stay steadfast to our calling as chaplains, even when first responders, even when the community, when society rejects or discards us as useless. Hey, thanks for listening today. Look forward to seeing you again, talking to you again. I'll be praying for you. Talk to you soon.